March 6, 1945. Cologne, Germany. In the shadow of the massive cathedral that had somehow survived years of Allied bombing raids that had reduced the rest of the city to rubble. Sergeant Robert Early stood in the turret of his M26 Pershing tank, call sign Eagle 7, watching the street ahead, through a haze of dust and smoke that hung over everything like a grey shroud, listening to reports over the radio net about German resistance that was supposed to be collapsing but kept materializing in unexpected places with firepower that suggested the Wehrmacht still had some fight left despite being pushed back to the Rhine. Early had been a tanker since North Africa, had fought through Sicily and Italy and France in Sherman tanks that he'd learned to respect for their reliability and mechanical soundness while simultaneously understanding their fatal weakness against German armor that outgunned and outclassed them in almost every engagement where the fighting came down to tank versus tank rather than tanks supporting infantry against dug-in defenders. The Pershing was different, heavier and more powerful than any American tank he'd crewed before, armed with a 90mm gun that could penetrate German armor at ranges where Shermans had to close to suicidal distances, protected by frontal armor, thick enough that German anti-tank guns that had torn through Shermans like tissue paper might actually be stopped. Eagle 7 had only arrived in theater 3 weeks earlier. One of 20 Pershings rushed to Europe in February 1945 as the American Army finally acknowledged what tankers had been screaming about since Normandy, that Sherman tanks were outmatched by German Panthers and Tigers and needed reinforcement by something heavier if American armor was going to fight on anything approaching equal terms. What Early didn't know as he scanned the ruins of Cologne through his periscope, what none of the 5-man crew aboard Eagle 7 could have anticipated, was that within minutes they'd be fighting for their lives against a German Panther tank that had been lying in ambush near the cathedral, that their duel would be captured on film by combat cameramen and become one of the most famous tank engagements of World War II, and that their survival would depend on the very capabilities that had made the Pershing's development so controversial and its deployment so delayed that it arrived too late to make a strategic difference in a war that was already won. The story of how American armor went from the obsolete designs of 1940 to the Pershing in 1945 is a story about institutional resistance to innovation, about the gap between what soldiers fighting in tanks knew they needed and what generals and ordnance departments were willing to provide, about how American industrial capacity and tactical doctrine evolved through years of combat that revealed weaknesses in equipment and organizations that peacetime planning had failed to anticipate. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the United States Army had fewer than 400 tanks, most of them light tanks armed with machine guns or small-caliber cannon that would have been useless against German panzers that were already demonstrating the effectiveness of massed armor operating as independent formations rather than being parceled out to support infantry. American tank doctrine in 1940 reflected the lessons of World War I, where tanks had been slow-moving support weapons designed to help infantry cross trenches and destroy machine gun positions, not independent strike forces capable of deep penetration and exploitation. The concept of armored divisions conducting rapid maneuvers and creating breakthroughs that could be exploited before defenders could react was foreign to American military thinking that still viewed tanks as supporting arms rather than decisive weapons. Development programs initiated after the fall of France in 1940 focused on producing large numbers of medium tanks that could be manufactured quickly using automotive industry techniques and components, resulting in the M3 and later the M4 Sherman, tanks that prioritized reliability and ease of production over the kind of heavy armor and large-caliber guns that German and Soviet designers were already building into their latest designs. The Sherman that emerged from this development process was in many ways an excellent tank for 1942, mechanically reliable in ways that German tanks weren't, easy to maintain and repair with components that could be sourced from American automotive suppliers, capable of carrying a crew in relative comfort across distances that would break down more sophisticated but less reliable designs. But the Sherman's greatest strength was also its fundamental weakness, because the design that made it easy to produce in vast, Numbers also made it difficult to upgrade with heavier armor and larger guns without redesigning major components and retooling production lines that were already churning out thousands of tanks using established processes. By 1943, tankers fighting in North Africa and Italy were reporting that Sherman tanks were outmatched by German Tigers and Panthers that could destroy Shermans at ranges where American return fire was ineffective. That frontal engagements against German heavy armor resulted in catastrophic losses that only American numerical superiority could offset. The crews were dying in tanks that burned when penetrated, because their ammunition stowage and fuel systems made them vulnerable to fires that crews grimly called cooking off. The reports from the field were explicit and detailed, written by commanders who'd watched their tanks destroyed and their men killed, describing engagements where German tanks had held defensive positions and destroyed multiple attacking Shermans before being overwhelmed by numbers or bypassed by maneuver that avoided direct confrontation. The Army Ground Forces and Ordnance Department received these reports and responded with solutions that reflected institutional priorities about production efficiency and logistical simplicity over the kind of technological competition that would require developing and fielding heavier tanks with more complex systems. The standard response was that German heavy tanks were rare, that most German armor consisted of Panzer IVs, that Shermans could engage effectively, that American doctrine emphasized combined arms operations where tanks worked with infantry and artillery and tank destroyers rather than fighting independent duels against enemy armor. This wasn't entirely wrong as doctrine, because American combined arms tactics were effective when properly executed, but it ignored the psychological and practical reality that tankers had to live with the knowledge that their vehicles were inferior in direct combat against the best German tanks, and that doctrine offering little comfort when you're the crew that encounters a Tiger, and your only options are to call for help or die trying to close to effective range. More fundamentally, the institutional response reflected a mindset that treated tanks as expendable assets that could be replaced from production lines rather than as platforms, whose crews had to believe in their equipment's capabilities if they were going to fight effectively. And this mindset would persist until battlefield realities in Normandy made it impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, small groups of engineers and forward-thinking officers had been working on heavy tank designs that could match German armor on more equal terms, projects that struggled for funding and support because they contradicted the institutional commitment to Sherman production and the doctrine that emphasized quantity over quality. The T-20 series of experimental tanks developed starting in 1942 explored heavier armor and larger guns mounted on chassis that borrowed components from Sherman production but incorporated improvements in suspension, transmission, and turret design that reflected lessons from German tanks that had been captured and studied. These experimental designs faced constant opposition from generals who argued that heavy tanks would be too slow and unreliable for the kind of mobile warfare American doctrine emphasized, that the shipping space required to transport them to Europe would be better used for additional Shermans or other equipment, that the complexity of adding another tank type to the inventory would create logistical problems that would outweigh any tactical advantages. The arguments weren't entirely unreasonable from a systems perspective, because logistics and production capacity were real constraints that affected what could be fielded and sustained in combat, but they reflected a conservative bias toward existing solutions that had worked well enough in limited combat experience and a resistance to the kind of aggressive technological development that was standard practice in German and Soviet armored forces. By 1944, as the T-20 series evolved into what would become the M26 Pershing, the design incorporated many of the features that tankers had been requesting. A 90mm gun capable of penetrating Tiger frontal armor at combat ranges, armor thick enough to resist German anti-tank weapons that destroyed Shermans routinely, a lower profile than the Sherman that made it harder to spot and hit, mechanical systems that learned from Sherman's strengths while addressing some of its weaknesses. The Pershing that finally emerged weighed 46 tons compared to the Sherman's 33 tons, slow by American standards, but still more mobile than the 60-ton Tigers it was designed to fight. Armed with a gun that finally gave American tankers the firepower to engage German heavy armor without having to maneuver to flank shots or call in artillery support or accept losses as the price of closing to effective range. The institutional resistance to fielding the Pershing reached its peak in 1944 when commanders in Europe, particularly General Leslie McNair, who headed Army ground forces, continued to argue that Shermans were adequate for American tactical doctrine and that heavy tanks were unnecessary, given American advantages in air, power and artillery that could compensate for tank versus tank inferiority. McNair's death in Normandy during Operation Cobra, killed by American bombs that fell short during a close air support mission, removed one of the most influential voices against heavy tank development. But by then, the Normandy campaign had already demonstrated the cost of institutional conservatism in blood and burned-out Shermans. The battles in the Bocage country of Normandy, where German tanks used the terrain's limited sight lines and natural defensive positions to ambush American armor, resulted in loss rates that shocked commanders who'd believed their numerical superiority would overwhelm German defensive advantages. Tankers reported engagements where Panthers positioned in tree lines destroyed entire platoons of Shermans as they advanced across open fields, where the only successful tactics involved accepting losses among lead tanks, while other Shermans maneuvered to flanks or called in artillery or air support, where crews understood they were the bait in a tactical system that traded their lives for time and position. The psychological impact of this inequality went beyond the immediate tactical problems, because crews who believe their equipment is inferior fight cautiously, hesitate when aggression might succeed, develop fatalistic attitudes that undermine unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. By August 1944, reports from Normandy had accumulated to the point where even the most resistant staff officers had to acknowledge that American armor needed reinforcement, that the Sherman's limitations weren't just theoretical concerns raised by alarmist tankers, but practical problems affecting operational effectiveness. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 reinforced these lessons when German armored formations, including significant numbers of Tigers and Panthers, achieved tactical surprise and local superiority that American forces countered primarily through artillery and air power rather than tank combat, because the Sherman simply couldn't fight German heavy armor in the direct confrontations that the Ardennes terrain often forced. The decision to rush Pershings to Europe in February 1945 came years too late to affect the war's outcome, but soon enough to give some American tankers better equipment for the final battles as Allied forces closed on the Rhine and prepared for the invasion of Germany itself. 20 Pershings were shipped to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions in a deployment that was more experimental than operational, intended as much to test the design under combat conditions as to provide meaningful reinforcement to units that were already pushing deep into German territory against opposition that was collapsing in some sectors while fighting with desperate intensity in others. The crews selected to man these new tanks were experienced veterans who'd survived months of combat in Shermans, men who understood tank warfare's realities and could evaluate whether the Pershing's theoretical advantages translated into practical improvements. Their initial reports were mixed, praising the 90mm gun's hitting power and the thicker armor that gave them confidence they'd previously lacked, but noting the Pershing's slower speed and mechanical teething problems that reflected rushed deployment of a design that hadn't completed full testing. The transmission was particularly problematic, prone to failures under the stress of combat operations, and the engine, while powerful enough to move the heavier tank, didn't provide the reserve power that made Sherman so responsive to driver inputs. These were exactly the kinds of problems that normally would be worked out during extended testing and refinement. But the urgency of getting heavier tanks into combat meant Pershings were deployed with known issues that crews and maintenance personnel had to work around. For Sergeant Early and the crew of Eagle 7, assigned to the 3rd Armored Division's spearhead as it drove toward Cologne, the Pershing represented hope that they might survive engagements that would have killed them in a Sherman, but also uncertainty about whether this new tank would perform as promised when the shooting started for real. The advance on Cologne in early March 1945 was part of Operation Lumberjack, The American effort to seize crossings over the Rhine before German forces could establish a coherent defensive line on the river's eastern bank, an operation that succeeded beyond expectations. When the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was captured intact on March 7th, but required fighting through cities like Cologne, where German defenders used urban terrain to offset American material advantages. Urban combat negated many of the tactical advantages that had allowed American forces to overwhelm German resistance in open country, because buildings channeled movement along streets that defending forces could cover with pre-sighted weapons, because rubble blocked fields of fire and created blind spots where ambushes could be positioned, because the close ranges meant that German anti-tank weapons that were obsolete in mobile warfare could still destroy American tanks before crews could react. The 3rd Armored Division's approach to Cologne involved methodical clearing of outer suburbs and industrial areas, using infantry to search buildings and identify strong points that tanks could then reduce with direct fire, a time-consuming process that reflected hard-won lessons about how to minimize casualties when fighting through defended urban areas. By March 6th, American forces had reached the city center and the cathedral that dominated Cologne's skyline, a massive Gothic structure that had been hit by bombs but remained structurally intact, while everything around it had been reduced to rubble and broken walls. The tactical problem at this point was securing the Hohenzollern Bridge that crossed the Rhine just north of the cathedral, a bridge that German engineers had prepared for demolition, but that American forces hoped to capture before it could be destroyed, securing a crossing that would eliminate the need for a costly opposed river crossing operation. Eagle 7 was part of the armored column pushing toward the bridge when the engagement that would make it famous began on a street near the cathedral, a narrow corridor between ruined buildings where the Pershing's size and weight became liabilities rather than advantages, and where the crew's survival would depend on factors that had nothing to do with technical specifications or comparative armor penetration tables. The crew of Eagle 7 consisted of 5 men, whose backgrounds and experiences reflected the American Army's character in the war's final year, a mixture of veterans who'd survived years of combat and replacements who'd joined units already in the field. Sergeant Robert Early, the tank commander, was from Pennsylvania, had joined the Army in 1942 and spent 3 years working his way from loader to gunner to commander through a combination of survival and demonstrated competence in the kind of battlefield promotions that were standard in units that suffered constant casualties. His gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, was from Pennsylvania as well, had been a gunner since North Africa, and had a reputation for accuracy under pressure that made him one of the better tank gunners in the division. The loader, driver, and assistant driver were all younger men, replacements who'd joined the unit during the winter and whose names would fade from historical record because their roles, while essential to the tank's operation, didn't involve the decisions that determined how the engagement played out. The crew had trained together for only a few weeks before being deployed, learning the Pershing systems and procedures while simultaneously advancing deeper into Germany against resistance that varied between fanatical and non-existent, depending on whether defending units were SS, formations that would fight to the death, or Wehrmacht, conscripts who surrendered at the first opportunity. The bond between crew members in a tank was different from infantry squad cohesion, more intimate because 5 men shared a space barely larger than a small room, more dependent on individual competence because a single mistake by any crew member could kill everyone, more fatalistic because tankers understood their survival depended on factors beyond their control, like enemy disposition and terrain and sheer random chance. Early had already lost crews in previous tanks, had survived engagements where other men in his unit had burned to death in penetrated Shermans, carried the kind of survivor's guilt and battlefield fatalism that characterized veterans who'd outlived their statistical life expectancy through a combination of skill and luck. For Early and Smoyer and the rest of Eagle 7's crew, the advance into Cologne was just another day in a war that seemed like it should be ending, but kept producing situations where people died violently and arbitrarily, where the only certainty was that nobody knew who would survive until the shooting stopped and you counted who was still alive. The German Panther tank that Eagle 7 would engage near Cologne Cathedral was crewed by men whose situation embodied the Wehrmacht's disintegration in the war's final months, experienced tankers operating a technically superior vehicle in a strategic situation that had become hopeless, fighting not because victory was possible, but because alternatives were worse or non-existent, or because psychological and institutional pressures continued fighting the path of least resistance, even when rational analysis suggested surrender or desertion. The Panther was one of the best tanks produced during World War II, armed with a 75mm gun, whose long barrel and high muzzle velocity gave it excellent penetration at ranges where most Allied tanks couldn't respond effectively, protected by sloped frontal armor that was effectively thicker than the raw millimeter measurements suggested, mobile enough to take advantage of terrain and position despite weighing 45 tons. German crews loved Panthers when they worked properly, but hated their mechanical unreliability and the maintenance requirements that made them difficult to keep operational when spare parts and qualified mechanics became scarce. By March 1945, surviving Panthers were often crewed by mixtures of veterans and replacements, commanded by sergeants or junior officers who'd learned tank warfare through combat experience rather than extended training, maintained by mechanics who improvised solutions to mechanical problems because proper replacement parts weren't available, operated under conditions where fuel shortages and ammunition restrictions limited what they could accomplish even when tactical opportunities appeared. The Panther that waited in ambush near the cathedral on March 6th had been positioned to cover the approach to the Hohenzollern Bridge. Its crew, knowing that American armor would have to advance along this street if they wanted to secure the crossing before German engineers detonated the demolition charges that would drop the span into the Rhine. The position was tactically sound, a hull-down location that exposed only the Panther's turret and gun, while keeping the more vulnerable lower hull protected behind rubble, offering excellent fields of fire along the street, where American tanks would have to advance, close enough to the cathedral that the massive structure provided both physical cover and a psychological anchor in a cityscape that had been reduced to ruins. What the German crew couldn't know was that the lead American tanks approaching their position weren't the Shermans they'd learned to destroy with routine efficiency over years of combat, but included a Pershing whose armor and firepower represented something closer to parity than anything they'd faced from American armor before. The element of surprise that had served German tank crews so well throughout the war, the ability to fire first from concealed positions against targets that couldn't respond effectively, was about to be neutralized by American armor that could both take hits and return fire with enough power to penetrate Panther armor if the shot placement was accurate. The stage was set for the kind of engagement that captured everything about late-war tank combat, where technological capabilities had reached, rough equality, but where human factors like crew training and situational awareness and sheer random chance determined who survived and who died in exchanges of fire that lasted seconds but whose outcomes echoed through the rest of the participants' lives. At approximately 10:45 hours on March 6th, Eagle 7 advanced along the street toward the cathedral as part of a mixed column that included Shermans from other units and infantry who moved cautiously through rubble checking for German defenders who might be hiding in damaged buildings. The Pershing's size made it difficult to maneuver in the narrow street, and Early was focused on navigating around obstacles while simultaneously trying to maintain situational awareness about potential threats that could emerge from any direction in the confusing urban environment. Behind Eagle 7, 2 Sherman tanks followed at intervals that gave them some space, but kept them close enough to provide mutual support if the lead tank encountered resistance. Technical Sergeant Jim Bates, a combat cameraman from the 165th Signal Photo Company, had positioned himself in an upper story of a damaged building overlooking the street, filming the American advance with the kind of professional detachment that combat cameramen developed as psychological protection against the horrors they documented. Bates had filmed combat operations since Normandy, had seen men killed and buildings destroyed and all the violent chaos of mechanized warfare, but he'd never captured tank versus tank combat at close range with the kind of clarity that his position near the cathedral would provide. What happened next occurred so quickly that participants later had trouble reconstructing the exact sequence of events, but the film that Bates captured provides a record that shows the engagement unfolding with a clarity that historical reconstructions rarely achieve. The German Panther fired first from its position near the cathedral, the 75mm gun sending an armor-piercing round toward the lead Sherman that was following Eagle 7 at a distance of perhaps 50 yards. The round struck the Sherman's frontal armor and penetrated completely, the impact and subsequent internal detonation of ammunition stowing, causing the Sherman to erupt into flames almost instantly. The crew, if any, survived the initial penetration, had perhaps seconds to escape before smoke and fire made the interior untenable, and the film shows figures emerging from hatches and falling or jumping from the burning tank in the panicked desperation of men who know they're on fire and have only moments to save themselves. The second Sherman, seeing the lead tank destroyed and recognizing the danger from an unseen enemy position, attempted to reverse away from the killing zone, but was struck before it could complete the maneuver. Another round from the Panther, penetrating the turret and causing catastrophic damage that killed crew members instantly and set the tank ablaze. In the space of perhaps 30 seconds, the Panther had destroyed 2 Shermans and demonstrated exactly why American tankers had learned to fear German heavy armor, why the institutional resistance to developing heavier American tanks had cost lives that better equipment might have saved. Early watching from Eagle 7's commander position saw both Shermans burn and understood immediately that his Pershing was now the only American tank in position to engage the German position, that if he withdrew, the German tank would continue to dominate this approach, and American infantry would be pinned down, and the entire advance toward the bridge would stall. The tactical decision was straightforward, but the personal calculation was more complex, because engaging meant exposing his tank and crew to fire from an enemy that had just demonstrated lethal efficiency. And the Pershing was so new that nobody really knew whether its armor would stop Panther rounds, or whether Early was about to get his crew killed in a tank that was supposed to be better than what they'd had before. Early ordered his driver to move Eagle 7 forward into a position where Smoyer, the gunner, could acquire the German tank's position and engage before the Panther could reload and fire again. The Pershing moved ponderously through the rubble-strewn street, each second feeling like an eternity as Early searched for the enemy position through his periscope, while knowing that German gunners were tracking his movement and preparing to fire as soon as they had a clear shot. Smoyer, looking through his gun sight, saw the Panther's position as the Pershing cleared the burning Shermans. The German tank's turret and gun barrel visible behind rubble approximately 70 yards distant, close enough that there would be no question about penetration if either tank's gunner could land a shot on target. The range was so close that most of the technical advantages of long-range gunnery were irrelevant. What mattered now was who could fire first, and whether that first shot would be accurate enough to penetrate armor and disable the enemy tank before it could respond. Early gave the fire command and Smoyer pressed the trigger, the 90mm gun firing with a concussion that rocked the Pershing and filled the fighting compartment with smoke and noise that made communication nearly impossible for the seconds it took for the crew to assess whether they'd hit. Through the smoke and dust thrown up by the gun's muzzle blast, Smoyer saw his tracer round impact near the Panther's turret, but not penetrate. The shot had been slightly off target, or had hit at an angle where the Panther's sloped armor deflected it. A miss that meant the German crew was still alive and still capable of returning fire. The Panther's gun swung toward Eagle 7's position, the German gunner tracking onto the target that had just revealed itself, and for a moment the engagement balanced, on the edge where either tank could have delivered the fatal blow, and where crew training and mechanical reliability and simple luck would determine which tank would survive and which would burn. Early, understanding that a stationary tank in an urban environment was a target waiting to be killed, ordered his driver to move forward through the intersection to a position where Eagle 7 would be harder to hit and where Smoyer would have a better angle on the German tank's position. The Pershing lurched forward, its transmission straining under combat stress, moving slowly enough that the German gunner had time to track the movement and fire before Eagle 7 reached cover. The Panther's round struck Eagle 7's frontal armor with an impact that felt like the tank had been hit by a massive hammer. the concussion throwing crew members against equipment and filling the interior with the screaming sound of metal hitting metal at high velocity. For a moment, Early thought they'd been penetrated, thought the round had gone through, and they were all about to die in the kind of internal explosion that left nothing but burned bodies and twisted metal. But as his vision cleared and he processed what had happened, he realized the Pershing's armor had stopped the penetration. The round had impacted, but hadn't gone completely through. The tank was damaged, but still functional, and the crew was still alive. The armor that American tankers had been begging for since Normandy, the protection that institutional resistance had delayed for years, had just saved 5 lives that would have been lost if this engagement had involved a Sherman instead of a Pershing. The relief of survival lasted only seconds, because the tactical situation demanded immediate response. The German tank was still operational and would be reloading for another shot, and Eagle 7's only chance was to fire again, and hope that Smoyer's second shot would be more accurate than his first. Smoyer, shaken by the impact but functioning on the kind of trained reflex that took over, when conscious thought became impossible, reacquired the German tank in his sight and fired again as soon as the loader had slammed another round into the breech. The 90mm gun fired its second shot, the high explosive round crossing the 70 yards between Eagle 7 and the Panther in a fraction of a second, impacting the Panther's frontal armor just below the gun mantlet, in a location where the armor was thinner and where the angle wasn't optimal for deflection. The round penetrated this time, tearing through armor and entering the Panther's fighting compartment, where it detonated among ammunition storage and fuel lines and the closely packed crew, the explosion killing or incapacitating everyone inside instantly, and setting off secondary detonations that turned the interior into a furnace. The Panther sat motionless for a moment, smoke beginning to pour from hatches and vision ports, and then flames erupted as internal fires reached fuel tanks and hydraulic systems, the kind of catastrophic fire that meant anyone still alive inside had only seconds to escape, before smoke and heat made survival impossible. Early, watching through his periscope, saw the Panther burning and knew the engagement was over, knew that his crew had survived what should have been a mutual kill situation where both tanks destroyed each other, knew that the Pershing's armor had made the difference between walking away from this fight and dying in a burning tank, like so many crews he'd known over 3 years of combat. The technical superiority that American tankers had fought against since Normandy hadn't been overcome by the Pershing's deployment. German armor was still formidable, and German crews were still skilled. But at least now American tankers had equipment that gave them a fighting chance in direct engagements, instead of requiring tactical workarounds or accepting losses as the price of accomplishing missions. Bates, filming from his position in the damaged building, captured the entire engagement from the Panther's first shot through the burning Shermans to Eagle 7's successful engagement and the Panther's destruction. Footage that would become one of the most watched pieces of combat camera work from World War II, precisely because it showed tank combat with an immediacy and clarity that was almost never captured on film. Most tank engagements occurred at ranges where camera work couldn't show detail, or in conditions where smoke and dust obscured visibility, or without cameramen positioned to capture the action. So the Cologne footage was unique in showing every element of an armored duel from positioning through fire exchange to final destruction. The film would be shown to tanker training classes for decades after the war as an example of urban tank combat and the importance of crew coordination and accurate gunnery under pressure, with instructors pointing out details like how Eagle 7's movement through the intersection disrupted the German gunner's tracking solution, and how Smoyer's second shot placement achieved penetration where his first had not. But the footage also showed something that training films usually avoided, which was the human cost of tank warfare in images of burning Shermans and crew members trying to escape flames, and a German tank that became a coffin for its crew when penetration turned the interior into an inferno. The sanitized language of after-action reports and tactical analyses couldn't capture what those images showed, which was that tank warfare was as brutal and final as any form of combat, and that the men who fought in tanks lived with the constant awareness that any engagement might be their last, and that dying in a burning tank was one of the worst ways to go in a war that offered numerous horrible alternatives. The crew of Eagle 7 spent the next several hours supporting the continued advance through Cologne, engaging German strongpoints with direct fire and supporting infantry as they cleared remaining resistance from the area near the cathedral and the approaches to the Hohenzollern Bridge, which German engineers destroyed on March 8th after American forces had already crossed the Rhine at Remagen and made the Cologne Bridge less strategically important than it would have been if captured intact. The Pershing had performed as designed in the engagement near the cathedral, its armor stopping a Panther round that would have destroyed a Sherman and its 90mm gun achieving penetration against German armor that American tankers had learned to avoid whenever possible. But the engagement had also revealed limitations that would affect how the Pershing was employed for the remainder of the war, because the tank's size and weight made it difficult to maneuver in urban environments where Sherman's smaller dimensions and better mobility allowed them to navigate narrow streets and position themselves more effectively. The transmission issues that had been noted during initial deployment became more problematic as Eagle 7 continued operations, requiring field repairs that took the tank out of service for several days and demonstrated that rushing the Pershing into combat had meant accepting mechanical reliability, problems that more extensive testing would have resolved. For the crew, the psychological impact of surviving the Cologne engagement was complex and contradictory. Relief at having equipment that could withstand hits from German armor, competing with awareness that luck had played a significant role in their survival and that the next engagement might produce different results. Early would later describe the engagement with the clinical detachment that veterans developed as protection against dwelling on how close they'd come to dying, noting that the Panther crew had been skilled and that Eagle 7's survival had depended on the Pershing's armor and Smoyer's gunnery and the driver's ability to execute movement orders under fire. All factors that had to align correctly, or the outcome would have been 5 more American tankers killed in a war that was grinding toward conclusion, but still producing casualties at rates that suggested the end couldn't come soon enough. The broader impact of the Pershing's deployment in early 1945 was more symbolic than operational, because 20 tanks couldn't significantly affect combat outcomes in a theater where thousands of Shermans were already operating and where American advantages in artillery, air power, and logistics meant that tactical deficiencies in tank performance could be compensated through combined arms operations. But for the tankers who crewed Pershings and for the soldiers who watched them perform in combat, the new tanks represented an acknowledgement that institutional resistance to heavy armor development had been wrong, and that American tankers deserved equipment that matched what they faced rather than requiring them to compensate for technical inferiority through tactics and courage and acceptance of casualties. The Pershing would be too late to fight in significant numbers during World War II, with only 20 seeing combat in Europe before the German surrender in May 1945, but the design would become the basis for American tank development in the immediate post-war period and would see extensive service in Korea, where its capabilities against Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks would prove more relevant than they'd been against German armor in the war's final weeks. For Early and Smoyer and the rest of Eagle 7's crew, the Pershing provided a combination of firepower and protection that allowed them to survive engagements that might have killed them in Shermans. And while the tank's limitations meant it wasn't the perfect solution that some tankers had hoped for, it was significantly better than what they'd had before and represented progress toward equipment that treated tanker lives as valuable rather than expendable. The psychological impact of the Tiger tank's reputation on American forces throughout 1944 and early 1945 was a phenomenon that exceeded the actual tactical threat posed by the relatively small numbers of Tigers deployed on the Western Front, because fear and reputation created effects that outlasted and outweighed the direct combat encounters between American and German heavy armor. The Tiger had been designed as a breakthrough tank, heavily armored and armed with the 88mm gun that had already proven devastatingly effective as an anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapon, capable of destroying Allied tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective, and protected by frontal armor so thick that only lucky shots or close-range flanking attacks could penetrate.